So welcome to another S2000 video. Today I'm going to be changing out the suspension on the car. Currently the car's sitting on just the OEM shocks and struts with Espelir ASD lowering springs. As you can see from the height, it actually sits pretty nicely. These are just stock AP2 wheels on 225 45/17 tires, but you know there's decent. It's a lot lower than stock. I wouldn't say like crazy amount, but it's actually at a pretty decent height. So I'm not looking to go too much lower than what the car is currently at, maybe a little bit, but we're gonna be taking out our lowering springs and our factory suspension, and I'm gonna be putting in these guys. So these are KW V3 Coilovers. I've had them actually just in storage for the past little while. I just never got a chance last year to get them installed in the car, so I'm finally getting into it now. So we're gonna do that. Now the first thing that you wanna do is obviously raise your car up off the ground, put it on jack stands, whatever method that you prefer, and we're gonna take off the wheels. So we're gonna get to doing that right now. So now with the car up on blocks, I can finally get the jack under there. So I'm just gonna go ahead and jack up the car right now. One little thing that I like to do, this is mainly especially for manual transmission cars, but I've kind of just gotten in the habit of doing it for any vehicle, is before I raise the car up, I'll just start loosening off the lug nuts. Not take them off completely because you don't want any of the weight shifting, doing anything weird. But I just loosen them up so when the car's in the air, you're not fighting against the wheels spinning. In this particular case, the front wheel is going to be off the ground. They're not drive wheels, so there's really nothing from stopping them from turning unless you have someone sitting in the car with the brake pedal depressed. So that's something that I like to do. So what I'm doing right now is just to actually raise the car up enough to get to the center jack point. I want to put this car on jack stands, but if I'm using this floor jack, I'm kind of covering the jack point on the car where I would want to put the jack stand anyhow. So that's what I'm doing. I'm going to do this to both sides and then raise the car up from the center jack point. So I usually do this with ramps. When I was at my parents' house, I unfortunately didn't bring the ramps here, so even on wood, it's a pretty tight fit. But it is slowly going up, so we'll get there. Okay, so now with the car fully in the air, we can go ahead and loosen off all the lug nuts and take off the wheels. All right, so we're just at the front passenger corner of the car. I just wanted to walk through basically the nuts and bolts that we're gonna be talking and touching with for this install. So this is our upper A-arm. There's two 17mm bolts on either side. We're gonna be taking those off. There's a ABS line that I believe is held on with a 10mm bolt just along the bottom side of this A-arm. There is, let me just zoom in there. That's our brake line, and there's a 10mm bolt holding the brake line onto the actual body of the shock. And then, sorry, this is a little bit tough to see. I'm gonna shine it up there, but as you can see, that is the back side of the 17mm that is holding the bottom of our shock. The other thing, when we go into the engine bay, here's the top hat. I believe these are two 14mm nuts that we're gonna have to take off as well too. So what I've gone and done is just lubricated everything just so with a penetrating oil so that things will be a little bit easier depending on your car. Obviously if your car's never been winter driven or driven in snow, rain, etc., then these should be relatively easy to get off. But these cars are getting a little bit older nowadays too, so if you're doing this now, at this point this car is 17 years old, so it doesn't hurt to put on some penetrating oil just to help loosen those off. So since we have that all done, we can get apart to taking things apart. And the first thing we'll work on is this A-arm. So for this bracket, there's actually one at the top, well not the top, one towards the outside of the car and one towards the inside of the car. They're hidden underneath, so it might not be the easiest things to see, but you can get a socket on there relatively easily. So once those two bolts are out, we can basically swing the ABS line out of the way. All right, next we're going to be taking off the bolts that actually hold the A-arm to the body of the vehicle. So like I mentioned, we have two 17mm bolts on either side, so we're going to take those off now. So with that out, there we go. As you can see, basically the reason we take this ABS line off is just so that you're not going to kink anything up. So we can leave that out of the way, and we'll take our brake line off now. You can take this 12mm bolt off, and you have that loose. So seems like the better idea is to go on this side to get access to everything. So now that we have that free, you can take off the top 14mm. So we're going to move to the top bolts, basically in the engine bay that hold the top mount in place. So these are two 14mm. They're a bit deeper though, so make sure you want to get a deep socket on there. So I won't fully loosen those yet until we get our bottom bolt in, just so that our strut doesn't fall out when we're loosening the other one. So again, I apologize for the angle. Can't really show things terribly too well from this vantage point, but you can't really see anything from the front. So what you're seeing right here is the back of that, I think it's a welded nut onto the actual shock body itself, but I'm going to be removing the 17mm bolt that's just on the other side. Okay, so now with that removed, you should be able to just slide the lower fork forward a bit, and before I forget, fully loosen off the top 14mm nuts. There you go. Alright, so I just have the two basically shock bodies laid side by side. Obviously on our right side we have our OEM unit with our Espelir ASD lowering springs, and then our right side we have the KW. So you'll note basically the big main difference is we have an external reservoir on the KW. That means more fluid, more suspension dampening. And it's a stainless steel body, which is going to be really nice. You know, we're not using this car in the winter or anything like that, but it's nice to have it from preventing from any seized activity. The other thing you'll notice, this is just a very linear spring. The KWs have a helper spring and then a separate spring as well too, and it's noticeably smaller in width basically for the springs. But the actual shock tubes are pretty similar in width. I think the KW is a bit thicker. And the other key thing to note is, so as I mentioned in the shot just before when I was taking off the lower mount, we have a welded nut on the stock unit. We don't have that on the KW. So they give you a nut that's applied, but the one thing that I've heard online is that you don't actually have a nut on the backside of the brake line bracket, which the OEM does. So you can see there's a welded nut. There's no welded nut here. The thing that you can do is, I believe it's an M6 nut that you need from any hardware store, so we'll make sure to grab those. Another thing that you'll notice, we have a top hat on our OEM one, but not on the KW. So these are V3s, and with KW V3s, you actually need to reuse your factory top hat. If you happen to get KW Club Sports, they come with pillow ball mounts that are the top hats, so you won't need to do that for this step. But in this case, for the V3s, we will need to reuse or put on a new OEM top hat. So I used some spring compressors just to hold the spring down and took off the top hat on the existing suspension. And what I'm gonna do is basically put this in the exact same order that it came off of. So the nut, this rubber piece, and then the actual top hat itself onto the KW. Okay, so now I have the top hat onto the KW unit. So the KW one actually uses these two. So there's two of these little nuts that go onto the top. I just threaded them on. What I did just to help everything easier was I threaded the spring down so that there was actually enough threads exposed on the top without me squeezing it down or whatnot. And I just put it on that way. And once I have everything in the car and the car back down on the ground, I'll do a final torque check on that top nut. So the other thing that I wanted to mention is on the OEM suspension, they're actually labeled left and right, and same with the KWs. So as you can see here, it says an R next to the part number. So this is the right hand side, so exactly the same as the passenger that we just took out right there. So basically we'll just do the reverse. We'll throw this guy in and we can do the other side as well. Pretty sure the reservoir needs to be inside the car. Just like so. Yep, that's exactly what it looks like. So we'll just thread in our top nuts just loosely so that coilover stays in place. Then make sure we're lined up. So a trick that I've read is we want to just jack up basically the knuckle to line up the holes on the actual bottom portion. So in this case, actually just seems like just lifting up the knuckle should be good enough. So we'll just try to get everything into place. There we go. And KW supplies a nut. I believe this one is a 19 millimeter. So on the stock body, stock shop, it was a welded in nut. But this time KW has a separate one. I believe it's the same for the rear, so we'll just go ahead and tighten that up. Okay, so with a wrench just on the back, we'll tighten this guy down. So 17 for the actual bolt and 19 millimeters for the... So that's just snugged up. We'll do the final torque just here in a bit. I just want to go ahead and attach our upper A-arm to that. So again, we'll just line up our upper A-arm to basically top areas. Just have to push the entire knuckle in, and then we can feed in our 17 millimeter bolts. Once everything's lined up. That's one side. We'll go ahead and do the other side. We'll ratchet just to snug things down. This side, we actually have, it's a little bit tight, so I'll just use a normal ratcheting socket. So I'm just gonna give you guys a quick little tip because I just literally went to, just before I filming this clip, went to go attach the brake line to the actual bracket that's on the shock body itself, and I realized I didn't install it properly. So what you wanna do, you can see that the brake line is actually going around the right side of the front shock. I had put it in where it was going around the left side of the shock. So in order to do this, I had the A-arm swung towards the back of the car. It's easiest to swing it to the front of the car, and also kind of use something like your knee or anything like that to prop the brake assembly towards the front of the car as well too. That'll give it enough movement so that there's enough slack in the line that you can feed the actual coilover through this area, thread it into the top holes, and still have enough room to snake that brake line through there. So I literally went to go put on the brake line and realized that I didn't do that, so I had to take apart everything, but here we are. So just keep that in mind when you're putting it back together. So now, finally, I'm gonna be getting to installing the brake line. So it's just held on by that 12mm bolt that we took off. So we just have it here. And like I mentioned before, you will need to get a new M6 nut, or alternatively, you could zip tie it or whatnot. I haven't gone out to the hardware store yet, but I'm still kind of working on buttoning up the rest of the car. So we'll leave that step for now, but we'll move on to the actual ABS line bracket, which, if you remember, was held on by two 10mm bolts. So just line that guy up and do those. So these guys don't have to be super tight. I don't know if there is a torque spec for them. If there is, it's probably pretty low. So once they're snug on there, we should be okay. Okay, so we'll just get to torquing some of the hardware down now. Well, stuff that we can at least. So basically, for the bottom shock mount, the torque spec is 47 foot-pounds. So that's what we have our torque wrench set at. We need a bit of an extension to get there. Okay, so we have it on there. Use our 19mm to hold from the back. Torque it to spec. So that's 47. Now for the A-arm, top A-arm bolts, that one is 76 foot-pounds. We'll just change our torque wrench setting. 76 foot-pounds. Do the front bolt. And the back bolt. Be good. Now for the rest of the bolts, we're going to be torquing them down when the car's on the ground and there's actually load on the suspension. So I'm just going to get to doing the other side and we'll get to the rears. Okay, so now that we have the front of the car relatively buttoned up, we'll move to the back. Basically, to get to the top bolts for the back suspension, we have to remove the interior trim paneling. So as you can see, it's basically held on by these little clips that I think you just lift up this tab and you pull out. So we're gonna go around and take that off, and I believe you have to remove the spare tire as well. Okay, so now with the rear trim removed, basically I had to remove the spare tire cover, and then also a section of the driver's side. It's actually connected in one single piece along the back, so I just removed enough to basically peel this section back so we have access to the bolts. So as you can see, there's our passenger side, and we have this gas line covering our driver's side. So the next thing we want to do is just pop open the gas cap. So take this guy off. And there's 3 bolts here, I believe, or 3 nuts. I believe these are 8mm nuts, so we want to take those off to loosen the connection from here. So the next thing we want to take off, there's a 10mm bolt that hard mounts the gas line to the actual body of the car inside. So we'll use a 10mm to loosen that guy off. Thankfully these were all not that tight, so it's pretty easy to get off. Now with that removed, we should be able to pull the fuel line basically in and out of the way, so I've read. Okay, so I just had a hell of a time trying to get this gas line removed. Everything that I've read online, it seemed like, okay, you gently pull back from where the gas line is, so you just pull it towards the car and it'll pop out. Mine kept on getting stuck for some reason, but I finally was able to get it out. As you can see, I removed the entire driver's side plastic piece as well too, the interior piece, just so to have more room with it not being in the way. So I think with that finally loose, we're gonna have enough access to get to the 14mm bolts on the top. So we'll get to that right now. Okay, so I didn't show how to actually take off the top 14mm bolts because, nuts, sorry, that hold the top of the shock in, because it's pretty tight in there, so I couldn't think I could get the camera in a good location. Things that I've read is that, so right there is our anti-sway bar link. A lot of people recommend basically removing that link. Gives you a little bit more leverage to take the rear suspension out. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. I believe it's a 14mm bolt or nut, but we'll check. Okay, so apologies if this is really hard to see. Just filming underneath the car, so I was pointing to the sway bar bracket. So what you see kind of in the middle of the screen right now is the bottom portion of that link. So I used a 14mm impact to get the nut started off. But as you know, with sway bar end links, basically the bolt section can spin. So what I did after I used the impact, I just used a normal 14mm wrench with a 5mm Allen to keep the bolt from spinning, and I got that nut off. So with that now disconnected, we can get to disconnecting the actual strut or shock. So right now that's the bottom shock bolt that we want to remove. So again, just very similar to the front, it's a 17mm, so we're just going to take that off and remove the rest of, well, basically I have the top nuts already loosened, but we're going to go ahead and take those off after that, and we should be able to drop the shock. Okay, so now to remove the shock, as you can see I already have it out. What I found was just stepping on the hub gives you enough leverage to push it down to be able to snake this through. So once you have that out, you can just take the whole assembly out. And very similar to the front, we're just gonna be removing the top hats again off our OEM suspension. So this top portion, we're gonna be reusing on the KWs. Okay, so now to basically feed our guy in, I believe, so these ones aren't actually marked as right or left. So I think if I put the reservoir towards the outside, it makes a bit more sense to me in terms of adjustment. Again, kind of push down and hub, and we should be able to get there. So I read online that a lot of people struggle with getting the bolt lined up for the bottom here without having to put pressure on the actual hub itself. So let's give it a shot. So after a few tries of just kind of wiggling the hub with my foot, finally got the bolt to get lined up. So we're just going to use the 19mm nut that KW supplies and just tighten this guy down. And just like up front, we can torque this down now, and it's 47 foot-pounds. Okay, so that's done. So we can just go ahead and just basically tighten up the top. Again, we want to leave it we're not going to torque it yet because we want load on the car before we actually do that. So I'm just going to do that right now. Alright, so now we just wrapped up putting everything back together with the exception of tightening up the top. I just wanted to mention that if you did disconnect the bottom sway bar end links, just to connect those, again you can use a 14mm wrench and a 5mm Allen key to hold the bolt from actually spinning. So what I'm going to do now is lower the car, and I'm going to basically put some load on the wheels, and then I can get to adjusting and tightening the top hat bolts. So before I set the car down, I just wanted to quickly run over a few things. So from the factory, KW has recommended heights, basically minimum and maximums to set the car at. I generally like my cars a bit lower, so I've just set the spring purchase to the minimum heights that they specify, which I think is 335 millimeters for the front, basically from the axle, the shock bolt hole on the bottom to the top of the spring perch, and then I believe it's 315 millimeters on the back. So from the factory, there's some settings for the rebound and the bump settings as well too for these. For the front, they come with 10 clicks of rebound and 5 clicks of bump, which you can see, sorry, it's right there. It's tough to tell here. You have to kind of almost shine a light behind the brakes to be able to see what number. And in the back, it's a lot easier to see. It's just on the back here, and there's a dial with the number indicator. And as you can see, I've left the plastics and the gas tube loose just because I had to adjust the top rebound with this knob. So I did that, set the rears basically at the lower height that KW recommends, and I'm just gonna be throwing on some wheels and tires, dropping the car down, seeing how it looks. If it's too low, then I can adjust the height from there. But the main reason that we wanna get the car down is so that we can actually tighten the top strut bolts and the actual top hat as well too. Okay, so now with the car on the ground, went around and basically torqued everything down, especially on the top. So in the factory, actually not the factory, in the KW instructions, it mentions that the top hat bolt that actually holds the top hat to the shock, that needs to be torqued down to 26 foot-pounds. And the actual shock mount bolts that mount to the body, those are 36 pounds. So pretty light. As you can see, didn't connect any of this stuff or put any of the trim back in because I needed access to those bolts. And same thing up front, same deal, same exact torque specs. 26 foot-pounds on this guy, and 36 foot-pounds on the outside. With the KWs, it comes with kind of two little nuts. Figured the second one is almost like a locking nut, so I just put on there and just basically butted it up against the old one so it doesn't back off. And yeah, just like that, we're done. So I'm just gonna roll the car, still on blocks in the front. I'm gonna roll the car off, roll it around a couple times just to let the suspension settle a bit, and we'll see how it looks. So there's the car on the ground now, rolled back a few times, let the suspension settle. It'll probably go a little bit further, but actually I'm really happy with the height that it's at. As you can see in the front, it's about like a finger gap. And in the rear, it's about the same as well. So pretty happy with that. The car might settle a little bit as we drive it, but yeah, I think it's just a touch lower than what it was on the lowering springs. I believe on the lowering springs you could see, kind of stick your finger in just straight. I have to angle my finger in at this height, so it is definitely a bit lower, not crazy, but yeah, pretty happy with how it looks. Car is super filthy, so don't worry about that. But yeah, so I mean, obviously from here, if you wanted to, you can fine tune your height basically by either raising or lowering it. Like I mentioned, I set the car at the lowest recommended height that KW recommends, and the KWs, they're interesting because unlike a lot of the different coilovers that are available today that have a shock body that threads into basically a sleeve, the KW ones, the spring perch actually just moves. So if you lower that spring perch too much, your shock effectively is losing travel, and therefore it could just lead to premature wear, basically inadequate performance. So I think that's why KW recommends the heights that they do. Honestly, at this height, it is fairly decently low. It's not crazy low, unlike some of my other cars that I've owned, but it's definitely a good height in my mind. And these wheels and tires, they're not the wheels and tires that are staying on the car, but I wanted to put them on for reference because these are basically the same exact specs that I'm going to be running on my new wheel setup. Don't worry, the T's are staying. Those will be kind of like a street wheel, but I wanted to go for a square setup on basically for track driving. So front and rear, it's a square, like I mentioned. They're 17/9 and a 63 offset, and the tires on these right now are 255/40 R17 all the way around. As you can see, the front fitment is pretty decent. It's pretty tight, so I do plan on getting some roll center adjusters just to add a bit more negative camber so that the wheel's clear, and I think I will have to roll the front fender slightly. The rears, I believe, they're just sunk in a touch, but I think they will clear the lip. We'll have to see, kind of just driving the car around and seeing how it is that way. But yeah, overall, really excited. Be sure to keep your eye out on a review video that I will have for the KWs. The car is still on parking insurance right now for a couple more weeks. There's a few more things that I want to do to the car maintenance wise. So once I get the driving impression and a review done, I'll let that video kind of speak for itself on how I feel about the KWs. Yeah, hopefully this helps you guys out with installing not just KWs, but just any coilover in general. You can apply these steps to basically both the AP1 and the AP2 S2000s. So yeah, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below, and be sure to look out for the next S2000 video. Thanks for watching.